a young woman who had always lived a very simple life. She came from a small neighborhood where people worked hard and supported each other. Her own family struggled with money, and even though she tried to stay positive, she knew she had to do something bigger to help them. When she heard about a job opening in a wealthy household across the city, she didn't think twice. She applied immediately, hoping that if she got the job, she could finally ease some of the burden her parents carried. When she was hired as a maid, she felt grateful. The house was nothing like anything she had ever seen before. It was huge, quiet, and filled with things she had only seen on TV, but her excitement didn't last long. From the first day, she sensed that this house had its own heavy atmosphere. Everything was in order, but there was no warmth inside the walls. The staff barely spoke, and the rules were strict. Still, she told herself she could handle it. After all, she was here to make a living. The millionaire who owned the house was known for being strict and very private. He carried himself with an air of importance, always speaking in a serious, measured tone. People followed his rules without question. The maid quickly learned that he did not like mistakes, he did not like noise, and most importantly, he did not like anyone touching the grand piano placed in the middle of the living room. It stood there like a piece of art, not a single fingerprint on it, not a single sound coming from it. Other staff members had already warned her on the first day. Don't go near the piano. He doesn't tolerate it. But the rule didn't bother her. She had no reason to touch the instrument anyway. She simply nodded and continued with her work. Each morning she followed a routine: clean the halls, dust the shelves, tidy up the living room, and keep everything spotless. Everything was smooth until she discovered something about the millionaire's son. The boy was around 14 or 15. He was quiet and rarely spoke to anyone. Because he was blind, he moved carefully, using his memory to navigate through the house. He listened closely to every sound, counting steps in his head, and always used his hands to guide himself. The maid noticed that he often paused near the living room. Even though he couldn't see the piano, he somehow sensed it was there. Sometimes, when no one was around, she saw him gently sliding his fingers along the cool wooden surface, as if trying to understand what it looked like. This small action touched her heart. She had a younger brother back home who loved music, but he never had the opportunity to learn properly. Seeing the boy's curiosity reminded her of him, but she didn't dare say anything to anyone. She simply continued her work while quietly observing the boy from a distance. Days turned into weeks, and the maid started understanding the boy's world a little more. He didn't complain, didn't argue, and he never demanded attention. He simply existed in silence. She could see that he longed for something that would make him feel alive, but he didn't know how to express it. One afternoon, while she was dusting the shelves near the living room, she heard the faintest sound. It was soft, like a single key being pressed ever so lightly. She turned around and saw the boy standing next to the piano, his hand resting on the keys. His touch was gentle, almost scared, as if he thought the piano might get angry. The maid froze for a moment, not because she was shocked, but because she felt the fear inside him. He looked like someone who wanted to fly but had been told all his life that he wasn't allowed to spread his wings. He quickly pulled his hand away when he sensed her presence. But the maid smiled and said in a soft tone, "It's all right. I won't say anything." The boy didn't respond with words, but she saw a tiny smile form on his face. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. And for the first time since she joined the house, she felt a warm feeling in her chest. That tiny moment changed everything for her. She started paying more attention to him. She noticed how he listened to the rain with full concentration, how he tapped the table when he heard a song playing faintly from a staff member's phone, and how he tilted his head when a breeze passed by as if trying to catch the rhythm of nature. The boy didn't just hear sounds, he absorbed them. One morning, while she was cleaning, she saw him sitting alone in the courtyard. He was tapping patterns on his lap, repeating them over and over again. They weren't random taps. They had rhythm. She approached slowly and asked, "Do you like music?" The boy hesitated but nodded slightly. He whispered, "I like sounds. They feel like pictures to me." His words filled the maid with a kind of emotion she couldn't explain. That evening, When she got home to her small room in the staff quarters, she opened her old bag and took out a tiny toy keyboard. It wasn't fancy or expensive. It was something she had bought years ago from a roadside market, thinking she would learn music someday. She never got the chance, but she didn't want to throw it away. It had sentimental value. The next day, she carried the small keyboard in her bag. She didn't have a plan. She didn't intend to break any rules. But something in her heart told her that the boy deserved at least one moment of music during a quiet afternoon. When the house was almost empty and the father was away, she found the boy again near the living room. He was tracing the patterns on the carpet with his fingers. She sat near him and whispered, "Can I show you something?" Slowly and very carefully, she placed the tiny keyboard in his hands. He touched it gently, exploring the shape, the buttons, and the small keys. She pressed one key to make a soft sound. The boy immediately turned toward the source of the note. She pressed another key and he smiled. She asked him, "Do you want to try?" He pressed a key with one finger, then another. The notes he produced were random, but the wonder in his expression was priceless. For those few minutes, he wasn't a quiet child trapped in a silent world. He was a young boy discovering something magical. The maid didn't stay long. She let him explore for a short while and then hid the keyboard again. But in those few minutes, something changed inside both of them. The boy realized that he could create sounds, not just listen to them. And the maid realized she could bring joy into his life. Even if only in secret, over the next few days she noticed a new energy in him. He walked with a little more confidence. He listened more carefully to footsteps, to the clinking of utensils, to the birds outside the window. It was as if every sound around him had become part of a bigger world. He was just beginning to understand, but she also knew she had to be careful. The millionaire father was extremely strict about anything happening without his knowledge. He kept his son under tight rules, believing that strictness would protect him. No one dared question him. The maid understood this, but she also felt that the boy deserved a chance to explore music. Even if quietly, there was one moment that stayed with her for days. She was walking past the living room when she saw the boy standing near the piano again. He wasn't touching it this time. He was simply standing there, listening to the silence. The piano didn't make a sound, but he seemed to hear something in it, some possibility, some dream. It was then she realized how strong his desire truly was. He wasn't just curious. He was drawn to music like a magnet. Every night, the maid lay in her small room thinking about him. She wondered why his father never let him explore music. Maybe the father feared his son would get hurt. Maybe he thought it was a waste of time. Or maybe he simply never noticed how much the boy loved sound. Whatever the reason was, the maid felt the boy deserved someone who understood him, even if that someone was just a maid. She didn't know what the future would bring. She didn't know whether her small act of kindness would get her fired one day. But deep in her heart, she felt that teaching him even a little bit of music wasn't wrong. It felt right. It felt human. And even though everything was still quiet, the first note of a hidden melody had already been played, soft, secret, and full of hope. After that first moment with the small keyboard, something changed inside the house, even though no one else noticed it. The boy had discovered a new world, and the maid had unknowingly opened a door he had been standing outside of his whole life. Their connection grew quietly, without words, without any bold actions, just through sound, patience, and trust. Every day, the maid carried the little keyboard in her bag. She never planned anything in advance. She didn't sit with the boy at a fixed time, nor did she act like someone trying to teach a big lesson. Instead, she waited for the right moment, those small slices of time when the house was calm. The father was out, and the boy was relaxed. Only then would she sit near him and bring out the keyboard. At first, their lessons were short. 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there. But the boy absorbed everything like a sponge. He learned to press keys gently, then firmly, then in patterns. He listened to how each key made a different sound. The maid would hum a simple tune, and the boy would try to find the matching note on the keyboard. Sometimes he got it wrong, but he listened so carefully that he corrected himself without her saying anything. The maid didn't think of herself as a teacher. She was simply someone who shared something beautiful with someone who had never experienced it. She didn't know much about real music theory, but she knew enough about feelings. She knew how music made the heart feel lighter. She knew how it filled silence with warmth. And she used those simple things to guide him. One afternoon, the boy asked softly, "Does the big piano make the same sounds as this?" His fingers were still moving along the tiny keyboard. The maid looked at the grand piano across the room, the one they were not allowed to touch. She felt a pinch of fear but gently answered, "Yes, it does. But its notes are richer and louder. It's like hearing your own voice echo in a large hall." The boy sat quietly, imagining it. Then he whispered, "I wish I could hear it." Those words stayed in the maid's heart all night. The next day was unusually busy in the house. Workers were fixing something in the garden, the chef was preparing for a small event, and several staff members were running around. While others were occupied, the boy sat in the corner on the floor, tapping soft rhythms on his knees. The maid noticed he was humming too, low and gentle, as if repeating the melody he had learned. She sat beside him and asked, "Do you remember all the tunes we practiced?" He nodded with a quiet smile. "I remember them by feeling," he said. "I don't see the keys. I just feel the steps between them." The maid was surprised by how naturally he understood this. He was learning in his own way, with his ears, his hands, and his heart. Over the weeks, the boy's confidence grew. He no longer hesitated before touching the keyboard. Instead of waiting for her to press a key first, he tried new combinations on his own. Sometimes he even surprised her by creating small melodies that she had never taught him. They were simple but unique, like secret stories made of sound. One afternoon, when the staff had stepped out for a meeting, the maid found him sitting near the living room carpet. He was listening to the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. "It sounds like a beat," he said. "Tick, tick, tick." He tapped the pattern on the floor with perfect timing. The maid laughed softly and said, "You hear music in everything, don't you?" He nodded proudly, but with every small moment of happiness, the maid also felt a growing fear. She knew how strict the father was. If he found out she was secretly teaching his son music, she might lose her job instantly. The boy might also get scolded, or worse, he might be forbidden to touch anything related to music ever again. She couldn't let that happen, so she became extra careful. She watched the door constantly during their sessions, and she only used the small keyboard, not the piano. Even though the boy longed to touch the grand piano again, she avoided any chance of risk. Still, the boy's curiosity kept growing. One day he asked her, "Why does my father not want music in the house?" The maid paused. She didn't know the full story. She had heard some staff members whispering that the father used to love music long ago, but after losing someone close, he had shut himself off. She wasn't sure if the story was true. And even if it was, she didn't want to speak about the family's private matters. So she simply said, "Sometimes grown-ups have reasons that even they don't fully understand." The boy stayed silent for a long moment, then whispered, "But music makes me feel alive." Those words made the maid's eyes water. She squeezed his hand gently and said, "And you deserve to feel that." One evening, the house was quiet. The father was away for a business meeting, and most staff members had gone home early. The maid was finishing her chores when she heard a soft note, coming from the living room. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't from the small keyboard. It was from the grand piano. She rushed inside and saw the boy standing next to the piano, his hands lightly pressing one key after another. He wasn't playing a full song, just exploring the notes. The sound filled the room with a gentle echo. He looked peaceful, as if he had been waiting for this moment for years. The maid wanted to stop him, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. She watched him for a moment, letting him feel the depth and beauty of each note. But after a few seconds, she stepped closer and whispered, "We have to be careful." The boy nodded, but he smiled softly. "It feels like the piano remembers me," he said. She guided him away gently, making sure no one else had seen them. But that moment left her shaken. It showed her something important. The boy wasn't just curious about music. He had a natural gift. His fingers moved smoothly, as if the piano was an extension of him. The maid started thinking deeply. Maybe she wasn't doing something small anymore? Maybe she was uncovering a hidden talent in him. Talent even he didn't know he had. She decided to become more intentional with their sessions. Instead of only letting him explore random sounds, she began teaching him small patterns. She pressed 3 keys in a simple rhythm and told him to repeat it. He did it flawlessly. Then she pressed 4 keys again. He repeated them without delay. It amazed her every time. She realized his memory was extraordinary. He didn't just hear the notes. He understood them as days passed. She also noticed how music affected his daily behavior. He walked with more confidence, smiled more often, and seemed less afraid of making mistakes. He became more expressive. Sometimes he would tell her how a certain sound made him feel how one note reminded him of sunshine, or how another felt like footsteps on a cold floor. His descriptions were poetic without him even trying. One afternoon, the maid showed him how to play a very simple tune. She broke it into tiny steps, guiding his fingers one by one. He listened, practiced, and within minutes he could play it smoothly. When he finished, he laughed quietly, a soft, shy laugh, but full of pride. She felt tears build in her eyes. Not sadness, but joy, but the risk was growing too. The father had become more alert lately. He would walk into rooms unexpectedly. He would ask more questions. He sensed something had changed in his son, though he didn't know why. The maid became extra cautious. She started hiding the keyboard deeper in her bag. She avoided long lessons and kept their sessions short and quiet. Still, despite her fear, she couldn't stop. She knew the boy needed this. And she knew she couldn't take away the one thing that made him feel alive. One evening, after teaching him a new melody, the boy said in a soft voice, "I feel like the world opens when I play." The maid placed her hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Then you must keep going. Even if no one knows, you must keep going." But neither of them knew that soon the secret wouldn't stay hidden. The music they created together was growing stronger, and secrets, no matter how carefully kept, have a way of finding their own paths. The days that followed felt different for both the maid and the boy. Their secret music sessions had created a quiet bond, something gentle, something honest, something that neither of them fully understood but both felt deeply. The boy was no longer the silent child who walked carefully through the house. He was changing. He had started humming soft tunes under his breath, tapping rhythms on any surface his hands could find, and even walking with a new kind of energy. The maid noticed these changes more than anyone else. She felt proud, yet she also carried a growing worry. She knew the father was sharp and observant. He wasn't the kind of man who ignored small changes. He had already begun asking questions, not directly, but in small ways. "Has he been more active lately?" he asked the staff one morning. "Why is he humming so much these days?" he asked another time. The maid tried not to show her fear, but inside, she felt the walls closing in. Still, she continued teaching him whenever she could. She couldn't bring herself to stop. She knew she was risking everything, but she also knew that taking music away from him would feel like shutting a window that had just been opened. One afternoon, the boy sat near the living room carpet, tapping a steady beat with his fingers. The maid sat beside him and said, "Your rhythm has become so good." The boy smiled shyly. "I feel like I can hear the world differently now," he said. "I can feel where each sound belongs." The maid felt her heart swell with pride. She never thought a child could learn so fast. That day she taught him a slightly more complex melody. At first he struggled to remember the sequence. His fingers hesitated, trying to find the right keys. But he didn't give up. He listened carefully. He repeated each part slowly, and after several tries, he played the entire tune without a single mistake. The maid clapped softly, and he smiled with a quiet joy she wished the whole world could see. But fate does not always wait for perfect moments. One evening, the maid was finishing her cleaning duties when she noticed that the father had come home much earlier than usual. His car was parked outside, and she heard his footsteps in the hallway. The other staff members froze for a moment. He rarely came home at this hour. She knew she had to be careful. She rushed to put away the small keyboard, made sure the boy was not near the piano, and went back to sweeping the floor. However, the boy didn't know his father had returned. He was standing near the grand piano with his fingers resting on the keys, practicing a simple pattern he had memorized. The maid saw him through the doorway, and her heart leaped into her throat. She wanted to call out to him, but there wasn't enough time. The father walked into the living room. He stopped in his tracks. The boy pressed a few keys softly, but with confidence, forming the beginning of a melody he had been practicing secretly. The sound echoed in the silent room, clear and warm. The maid felt as if her breath had been taken away. She expected the father to shout, to storm forward, to pull the boy away from the piano, but instead the father froze. His expression changed, not anger, not confusion, but something deeper. Something like shock mixed with disbelief. The boy didn't notice him standing there. He continued playing, carefully repeating the tune. His fingers trembled slightly, but he kept going. The father's face softened in a way the maid had never seen before. He looked as if someone had pulled him into a memory he thought he had buried long ago. His eyes lingered on his son's hands, moving gracefully across the keys. The maid stood quietly, terrified but unable to move. Her heart pounded in her ears. The boy pressed another set of keys, this time forming a little pattern taught by the maid. It wasn't perfect, but it had emotion. It had heart. Suddenly the father spoke, his voice low and trembling. "Who taught you that?" The boy gasped and pulled his hands away from the piano instantly. He stepped back, nervous and unsure. I just learned the sounds," he whispered. The maid felt a wave of fear wash over her. She stepped forward, lowering her head. "It was me," she said softly. The room fell silent again. The father looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Anger? Confusion? Hurt?" She couldn't tell. "You?" he asked, his voice sharp. "You taught him? After I clearly said no one should touch this piano?" The maid felt her legs tremble, but she didn't run. She stood in front of him, her voice quiet but steady. "He has a gift, and he was curious. I only helped him explore what he already felt inside." The father took a step closer. The maid prepared herself for the worst. She imagined him shouting, firing her on the spot, maybe even telling her to leave the house immediately. But something unexpected happened. He closed his eyes. He took a long, slow breath. When he opened them again, his expression had changed. There was no anger. Instead, there was something heavy, like a man carrying a memory too big for his chest. "You don't understand," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Music took something from me, something I could never get back." The maid didn't know what he meant, and she didn't want to invade his pain. She simply said, "Sir, music is giving something to him. Something he never had." The boy stood there silently, feeling the tension but not fully understanding it. He reached for the maid's hand, sensing her fear. The father noticed the gesture, and his expression softened a little more. He walked toward his son slowly. "Play it again," he said. The boy hesitated. I don't want to break the rules," he whispered. The father's voice trembled slightly as he repeated, "Play it." The maid gently guided the boy back to the piano. She placed his hands on the keys and stepped aside. The boy pressed the first few notes. The father listened intently. The melody was simple, but it carried innocence, hope, and the purity of someone discovering beauty for the first time. The father covered his mouth with his hand, as if trying to hold back an emotion he wasn't prepared for. The maid watched him quietly, realizing that this moment was bigger than any of them. The boy finished the short tune and turned toward the sound of his father's breathing. "Did I do something wrong?" The father dropped to his knees beside him and pulled him into a gentle embrace. "No," he whispered. "You did something I never thought I'd hear again." The maid felt her chest tighten with emotion. She had never seen the father vulnerable like that. After a long pause, the father stood up. He didn't shout. He didn't blame her. Instead, he looked at the maid and said, "Tell me the truth. How long has he been learning?" The maid hesitated, then softly replied, "A few weeks." "And you taught him?" he asked. "Yes, sir." He studied her for a moment. "Why?" The maid lowered her eyes. "Because he loves music. And because he deserves to feel joy like everyone else." The father took another deep breath. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he said something she never expected. "Tomorrow, I want to hear him play again." The maid's eyes widened in surprise. She nodded silently. The father turned to his son and said gently, "We'll talk more about this, but for now, I am proud of you." Those were words the boy had never heard from him before. The maid felt her fear dissolve into a warm wave of relief. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if the father would still be strict about music. But she knew one thing for sure: something inside him had shifted. Something had softened. And for the first time, the secret music was no longer just theirs. It had finally reached the father's heart. The next morning began with an unusual silence inside the mansion. It wasn't the cold, heavy silence the maid had felt when she first joined the house. It was different. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. Even the staff moved quietly, as if they sensed a change coming but didn't know what it was. The maid woke up with a strange mix of fear and hope. She couldn't forget the moment from the night before, the father kneeling beside his son, the softness in his voice, the surprise in his eyes when he heard the boy play. A part of her wanted to believe everything was going to be okay now. Another part of her feared that he might change his mind, that he might still think she had crossed a boundary. When she entered the main house, she saw the father standing near the large window, staring outside. He didn't look angry, he looked thoughtful. She greeted him softly, and for the first time since she had started working there, he greeted her back with a calm, almost gentle nod. It surprised her. It even scared her a little. The boy was sitting on the couch with his hands folded neatly on his lap. He looked nervous too. When he heard the maid's footsteps, he lifted his head slightly and smiled. She walked to him and whispered, "It will be all right, just breathe." He nodded. A little while later, the father walked toward them. His voice was steady, but there was something vulnerable behind it. "I want to hear the melody again," he said. The boy stood up slowly. The maid guided him to the piano. His fingers trembled for a moment, but she placed her hand on his shoulder and he relaxed. Then he pressed the first few keys. The same tune he had learned. The notes were a little shaky at first, but then he gained confidence. He played it with feeling, just like he always did in their secret lessons. The father listened quietly. He stood still, hands clenched behind his back. But his eyes were filled with an unspoken emotion as the room filled with the sound of his son's music, pure, simple, honest. When the boy finished, the father exhaled slowly, as if the music had filled a space inside him that had been empty for too long. He walked closer. "Who taught you the idea of rhythm? How did you learn to place your fingers like that?" The boy touched the piano gently and said, "I felt the sounds, and she helped me understand them." Then he turned his face toward where the maid was standing. The father looked at her deeply, not with judgment, but with a kind of quiet respect. He sat down on a nearby chair, and for the first time, he asked her to explain everything. Her heart pounded as she told him the truth. How she had seen the boy touching the piano, how she had seen his curiosity, and how she had used her little keyboard to teach him simple notes during quiet afternoons. She admitted everything honestly, without excuses. When she finished speaking, she expected anger or disappointment, but instead the father sat silently for a long time. Then he rubbed his forehead and said softly, "Music was once the biggest part of my life. Someone very dear to me loved the piano more than anything." The maid didn't interrupt. She listened quietly. The father continued, "When I lost her, I couldn't bear to hear the piano anymore. Every note reminded me of her. So I closed everything related to music." His voice trembled slightly, like someone who had been hiding a wound for years. The maid lowered her eyes. Suddenly she understood why the piano had stayed untouched for so long. Why the house always felt heavy, why the father never allowed music inside. He wasn't trying to stop his son from living, he was trying to protect himself from reliving his pain. But his son, without knowing any of that, had reopened the door he had closed. The father finally looked at the maid. "And yet, hearing him play yesterday, I felt something I thought was gone forever." The boy stood silently, listening to every breath in the room. He whispered, "Father, I didn't mean to hurt you." The father immediately knelt beside him and held his hands. "You didn't hurt me," he said. "You reminded me that beauty still exists." The maid felt tears prick her eyes. She had never witnessed such a moment between them. After a long pause, the father said something that shocked both of them. "I want you to continue teaching him." The maid blinked, not sure if she heard correctly. The boy gasped softly. The father stood up and walked toward the piano. He touched the keys gently, just as his son had done. A faint, unfamiliar smile appeared on his face. "If he has a gift," he said, "then it must be nurtured. And if music brings him happiness, then music must stay in this house." The maid felt a wave of relief that made her knees weak. She nodded with gratitude, unable to find any words. From that day forward, things changed. The father gave them permission not just to continue lessons, but to use the grand piano itself. The first time the boy sat in front of it officially, with his father watching, his hands trembled with excitement. The maid guided him gently, and the father listened with pride that filled the room like warm sunlight. Their lessons became longer, more focused, and filled with joy. The maid taught him new melodies, more complex rhythms, and even small techniques she had learned from watching videos long ago. Even though she wasn't a professional teacher, she taught with heart, and the boy learned with passion. Every day, the boy grew more confident. He began creating his own melodies, soft, beautiful pieces that sounded like stories told through notes. The father listened often, sometimes with closed eyes, letting the music heal old wounds he had never dared to face. The staff noticed the changes too. The house didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt alive. One afternoon, the father approached the piano while the maid was helping the boy practice. He asked softly, "May I sit with him?" The boy smiled and nodded. The father placed his hand on the boy's and guided him to press a sequence of keys. Their fingers moved together, slow but steady. The maid watched them with a warm heart, realizing that music was giving them something even she couldn't give: connection. Weeks passed, and the boy's progress amazed everyone. The father even hired a professional music instructor to support the maid's efforts. But he insisted that she remain part of his son's learning journey, saying, "You didn't just teach him music, you gave him courage." Slowly, the relationship between father and son grew deeper. They talked more, they shared more. The boy felt safe asking questions, and the father learned how to listen not just with his ears, but with his heart. Months later, the father decided to organize a small gathering at the house. Not a large event, not a loud one, just a simple evening where close friends and a few staff members could hear the boy play. The maid helped him prepare for it. She practiced with him every day, helping him remember each part of the melody. When the evening arrived, the boy sat nervously in front of the piano. The guests quieted down. The maid stood near him, giving him silent encouragement. The father placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder and whispered, "Just play what you feel." And the boy played. His melody flowed through the room like a gentle breeze, soft, emotional, filled with innocence and hope. It touched every heart in the room. When he finished, the guests cheered softly. The boy smiled in a way no one had ever seen before. The father wiped tears from his eyes. He pulled his son into a warm embrace and said, "You made me proud, my boy." The maid watched with a smile. She felt no claim over the spotlight. She didn't want recognition. Seeing the boy shine was enough. Seeing the father embrace him was enough. Later that night, as the event ended, the father approached the maid. He looked calmer, lighter, almost like a new person. "Thank you," he said softly, "for everything. You didn't just teach him. You helped heal this home." The maid lowered her eyes with humility. "I only did what felt right," she replied. The father smiled. "Sometimes doing what feels right is the greatest gift anyone can give." From that day onward, music never left the house again. The boy continued growing as a pianist. The father rediscovered a part of himself he thought he had lost, and the maid, quiet, kind, and strong, became the bridge that brought them both back to life. And just like that, a secret lesson that started with a tiny keyboard blossomed into something beautiful, something that changed their lives forever.